The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the most significant disruption to global geopolitics since World War II. A conflict of this scale in the 21st century resurrected the specter of large-scale war in Europe and exposed the vulnerabilities of an international system many believed to be stable. It served as a brutal reminder that rivalries between major powers still shape the world's destiny. One of the most significant impacts of this conflict was NATO's expansion, now including Finland and Sweden. This historic shift not only redefined the balance of power in Europe but also introduced new strategic challenges for Russia. Moscow, which sought to limit the influence of the Western alliance, faced the opposite outcome: a more united and prepared West. With Finland joining NATO, the alliance's land border with Russia nearly doubled, creating a new dynamic of military pressure in Northern Europe. This shift placed the Kremlin in an even tougher position as it grappled with the political, military, and economic costs of the war in Ukraine. The consequences of the invasion extended far beyond the battlefield. The war also shattered the notion that such conflicts were relics of the past. Historically neutral countries, such as Sweden, re-examined decades of foreign policy to ensure their security. This reassessment highlighted how the invasion of Ukraine was a turning point for all of Europe, forcing even the most stable nations to reconsider their roles in global politics. Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO was one of the most striking outcomes of the war in Ukraine. Finland formalized its membership in April 2023, followed by Sweden in 2024, marking the end of decades of military neutrality for these countries. This move was not just a response to Russia's invasion but also a historic shift in Northern Europe's security policies, with profound impacts on the regional balance of power. With Finland's accession, NATO's land border with Russia more than doubled, increasing from around 1,200 kilometers to over 2,500 kilometers. This new reality presented Moscow with a strategic dilemma: how to handle the direct presence of a military alliance it considers hostile in its immediate neighborhood. Russia found itself more isolated and vulnerable as NATO extended its military and political reach. The war in Ukraine was the catalyst for this transformation. Before the conflict, the prospect of these countries joining NATO seemed unlikely, even with their growing cooperation with the alliance over recent decades. However, the perception of threat following Russia's invasion pushed Finland and Sweden to abandon neutrality and seek collective protection. This move was seen as a geopolitical defeat for Vladimir Putin, who aimed to weaken Western influence. Sweden's entry, though later, also marked a historic shift. The country, long known for its neutral stance grounded in pacifist ideals and international mediation, realized that neutrality was no longer enough to ensure its security. Its proximity to strategic regions such as the Baltic Sea made NATO membership a matter of survival in an increasingly unstable environment. The inclusion of Finland and Sweden strengthened NATO's position in Northern Europe and created new strategic barriers for Russia. The Baltic Sea, already a tense region, is now largely controlled by alliance members. For Moscow, this scenario increases risks and limits its room for maneuver, underscoring the far-reaching consequences of the war in Ukraine. NATO's expansion, driven by the inclusion of Finland and Sweden, has intensified tensions with Moscow, which has long argued that it is being militarily encircled by the Western alliance. For the Kremlin, this advancement is seen as a direct threat to national security. The Russian narrative reinforces the notion that NATO's growing presence along its borders undermines its ability to defend its strategic interests. Even before the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin used NATO's expansion as a justification for his aggressive foreign policy. This argument was central to the decision to invade Ukraine in 2022, with the stated goal of halting Western advancement in Eastern Europe. However, contrary to expectations, the war accelerated the process of accession for countries like Finland and Sweden, producing an outcome directly opposed to Russia's interests. With Finland doubling NATO's land border with Russia, the sense of encirclement gained even more prominence in the Kremlin's rhetoric. Moscow now faces a more unified and consolidated military alliance, further limiting its maneuvering room in Europe. The bloc's expansion reinforced Russia's perception of strategic isolation and weakened its regional influence. Despite Russia's narrative of encirclement, the geopolitical reality is more complex. The decision of countries like Finland and Sweden to join NATO was not solely driven by Western pressure, but primarily by the perception of threat following the invasion of Ukraine. Moscow's rhetoric, which seeks to blame NATO, overlooks the pivotal role its own actions played in changing these countries' stances. Far from easing tensions, this situation has intensified militarization in the region, especially around the Baltic Sea and Northern Europe's borders. The result has been a strengthening of NATO's so-called eastern flank, with more troops, military exercises, and defense investments. For Russia, the war in Ukraine has brought about a development it sought to prevent: a more present and united NATO, increasing Moscow's strategic challenges. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has criticized NATO's approach to its borders, calling it of strategic encirclement. This rhetoric escalated with the inclusion of the two Nordic countries, symbolizing the loss of any margin of influence the Kremlin had hoped to maintain in Northern Europe. President Vladimir Putin has often cited NATO's expansion to justify actions in Ukraine. According to the Russian narrative, the alliance's presence in Eastern Europe directly threatened the country's security. This reasoning was used to garner domestic support and justify the invasion, presented as a defensive measure to prevent Ukraine from joining the Western military bloc. However, the result was the opposite. Instead of pushing NATO away from its borders, the war in Ukraine accelerated the movement of previously neutral countries toward the alliance. The NATOization of Finland and Sweden exemplifies how Russia's strategy ended up strengthening what it sought to avoid. This geopolitical irony exposed the Kremlin's lack of control over the conflict's outcomes. Moscow continues to argue that NATO's expansion threatens global stability and aims to contain Russian power. However, many experts point out that the alliance's growth is a direct response to Russia's aggressive behavior, particularly after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the war in Ukraine. The narrative of encirclement is widely seen as a political tool used by the Kremlin to foster nationalism and internal unity. While the encirclement rhetoric resonates with part of the Russian population, its effectiveness as an international justification is diminishing. Finland and Sweden's NATO membership highlights that Russia's neighboring countries prefer aligning with the West to ensure their security, reinforcing the Kremlin's isolation. The alliance's expansion, seen as inevitable in the current context, raises questions about Russia's next steps to navigate this new reality. The term Finlandization emerged during the Cold War to describe Finland's enforced neutrality toward the Soviet Union. Despite being a Western democracy, Finland refrained from formally aligning with NATO or any military bloc to avoid conflict with Moscow. This strategy preserved the country's sovereignty but came at the cost of a constrained foreign policy shaped by Soviet pressures. The term symbolizes the concept of geopolitical survival in a position of vulnerability. For Finland, sharing a direct border with the Soviet Union meant living with the constant risk of invasion. Consequently, the country adopted a pragmatic approach, maintaining good relations with Moscow while safeguarding its independence. This stance was enough to avoid direct confrontation but imposed various political and strategic limitations. The war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive behavior dismantled this model. Finland realized that neutrality was no longer a guarantee of security. Russia's invasion of a neighboring country sounded alarms in Helsinki, prompting the Finnish government to align itself directly with the West. Joining NATO in 2023 marked the end of decades of neutrality and opened a new chapter in the country's geopolitical history. The abandonment of Finlandization also reflects changes in the global order. During the Cold War, Finland had no viable options beyond neutrality due to Soviet dominance in the region. In the current context, NATO's presence as an active and strengthened alliance has provided the country with an alternative to address the insecurity triggered by the war in Ukraine. This transformation in Finland's stance sends a clear message to Moscow. Finland, which long sought balance between East and West, has decided to commit to collective defense alongside NATO allies. This decision reinforces Russia's strategic isolation and exemplifies how traditional geopolitical concepts are being revisited in the face of new threats. Sweden, on the other hand, has long been known for its neutrality, a cornerstone of its foreign policy for more than 200 years. This position was built on the idea that staying out of military alliances was the best way to ensure security and stability. During both World Wars and the Cold War, Sweden avoided officially taking sides, relying instead on its capacity for mediation and dialogue. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 profoundly shifted this perspective. Geographical proximity to the Baltic Sea and increasing Russian aggression led Sweden to reassess its historical stance. Neutrality, once considered an advantage, began to be seen as a vulnerability during a time of growing instability in Europe. Sweden's accession to NATO, completed in 2024, marked a historic turning point for the country. The decision to join a collective defense alliance was seen as the best way to protect its sovereignty. This move was a direct response to the heightened perceived threat, but also a reflection of how quickly the balance of power in Northern Europe was changing. Sweden's shift also highlights its desire to strengthen its position in the Baltic Sea, a region of strategic importance to both Moscow and the West. With the sea increasingly dominated by NATO countries, Sweden has assumed a key role in bolstering regional security. This alignment has benefited not only Sweden but also the entire alliance, which gained a new strategic foothold in Europe. This change in Swedish policy exemplifies how the war in Ukraine is shaping the decisions of countries that previously relied on neutrality as a security strategy. Sweden, which long represented a model of independence from military blocs, is now part of a global alliance. For Moscow, this represents yet another geopolitical setback, demonstrating how its aggression has strengthened NATO rather than weakening it. The decision by Finland and Sweden to join NATO may seem recent but has deep roots in decades of cooperation between these countries and the alliance. Since 1994, both have been part of the Partnership for Peace (PFP) program, a NATO initiative aimed at strengthening European security by involving both members and non-members. This partnership laid the groundwork for formal integration. Through the PFP, Finland and Sweden participated in joint military exercises, peacekeeping missions, and intelligence sharing initiatives. This gradual involvement allowed both nations to develop interoperability with NATO forces, making their transition to full membership much smoother. Their integration was a logical continuation of years of close collaboration. The strengthening of this partnership also coincided with rising tensions with Russia following the annexation of Crimea in 2014. As Moscow intensified its actions in Eastern Europe, both Finland and Sweden deepened their cooperation with NATO, contributing to surveillance operations in the Baltic Sea and fortifying their defenses. These measures signaled their readiness to respond to potential threats. Although not formal members at the time, their relationship with NATO had always been close, especially due to their strategic locations. Finland, with its extensive border with Russia, and Sweden, with its role in controlling Baltic Sea routes, were valuable partners for the alliance in terms of intelligence and military presence. This proximity always suggested that full membership was a possibility if the security landscape changed. The war in Ukraine turned what was once cooperation into full membership. Decades of collaboration allowed Finland and Sweden to integrate seamlessly into NATO structures, contributing their expertise and capabilities. This process consolidated an effort that began years ago and strengthened the alliance during a period of significant geopolitical challenges. NATO's expansion to include Finland and Sweden introduced new strategic challenges for Russia, increasing military pressure along its borders. Finland's accession more than doubled the length of NATO's direct land border with Russia, now exceeding 2,500 kilometers. This forced Moscow to redirect resources and attention to the north, creating tensions in a region that had previously been relatively stable. The military impact is equally significant. With these two countries integrated into NATO, Russia faces an enhanced Western military presence in the Baltic Sea and along its northern borders. NATO bases, air defense systems, and joint exercises are now closer to Russian territory, further constraining the Kremlin's strategic maneuverability. For Vladimir Putin, NATO's expansion represents a direct geopolitical defeat. When he initiated the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin hoped to weaken and divide the alliance, but the result was the opposite. The war unified Western countries around a common security agenda, consolidating NATO as a powerful force in international politics. For Moscow, this not only heightened its isolation but also reinforced its vulnerability to the West's military and political power. Beyond military challenges, there are significant economic and diplomatic implications. NATO's expansion further limits Russia's ability to project power in strategic regions such as the Arctic and the Baltic Sea, which are crucial to its economic interests. At the same time, Russia's isolation in international organizations has grown, leaving less room for dialogue or alliances to counterbalance Western influence. This new geopolitical configuration underscores how the war in Ukraine has reshaped Europe's security dynamics, leaving Russia in an increasingly difficult position. Diplomatic isolation, combined with economic sanctions and military pressure, weakens the Kremlin's ability to negotiate from a position of strength. For Moscow, the geopolitical playing field is becoming increasingly unfavorable, while NATO emerges as the primary beneficiary of this realignment. The war in Ukraine has triggered a profound transformation in Europe's security landscape, breaking with paradigms that had defined the continent since the end of the Cold War. The vision of a peaceful and stable Europe has been replaced by a reality of growing tension, where military deterrence and strategic alliances have become top priorities. NATO's expansion to include Finland and Sweden symbolizes this new era, where cooperation is seen as the best way to address shared threats. The integration of these two countries into NATO marked the beginning of a new chapter in European security, demonstrating how collective efforts can shift the balance of power across an entire region. This change was catalyzed by Russia's aggressive behavior, which, in attempting to assert its influence, ended up strengthening ties between its neighbors and the West. Europe, once hesitant to expand its military presence, is now more prepared to act collectively. Moreover, the global implications of this shift cannot be ignored. NATO's strengthening and the reorganization of international alliances have direct consequences for other regions, such as the Pacific, where competition among major powers is also intensifying. The war in Ukraine has not only reignited historical rivalries but also reaffirmed the importance of coordination among democracies to confront authoritarian challenges. Russia, meanwhile, faces growing isolation and struggles to maintain its position on the global stage. NATO's expansion and Europe's bolstered defenses make it increasingly difficult for Moscow to achieve its strategic goals. However, the end of this conflict and its long-term consequences remain uncertain, and Russia's next steps will likely determine how this new global order takes shape. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel now. Stick around for the next documentary on your screen. We'll see you there.